In spite of Corneille and in spite of Racine up to Phèdre, the end of the French 17th century suffered from, or rather benefited by, whichever you like, a first collapse of the myth alike in manners and in philosophy. The ordering, not to say the drilling, of feudal society by the king state involved somewhat far-reaching changes in emotional relations and in customs. Marriage became once again the basic institution and reached a point of stability at which it was with difficulty to be made to remain in subsequent centuries, and which in previous centuries had not been known. An alliance between two families was negotiated with as much formality as one by diplomatists. If the parties happened to have a real or fancied inclination for one another, this merely added an element of exquisite perfection and of agreeable luxury to the arrangement, an ultimate touch of whimsicality amounting almost to insolence. In the 18th century, it quickly came to be considered bad taste. Suitability of rank and a matching of qualities were the perfect standards of a satisfactory marriage, curiously like the custom of China. Indeed, it was in the rational 17th century that European manners became severed from religious beliefs, even as Confucius considers they should be, and although the change apparently attracted no notice, were made to conform to the current laws of reason, and hence to ignore the Christian absolute. No longer the unforeseeable effects of grace, but, quote, worth, end of quote, decided that there should be a union. And it was worth alone which rendered, quote, agreeable, end of quote, a prospective partner whose pros and cons had been ingeniously weighed. Ingeniously weighed. No longer the unforeseeable effects of grace, but, quote, worth, end of quote, decided that there should be a union. And it was, quote, worth, end of quote, alone which rendered, quote, agreeable, end of quote, a prospective partner whose pros and cons had been ingeniously weighed. Such was the triumph of Jesuitic morality. Emotion was imprisoned in the showy contrivances of the classical Baroque. For that matter, the analytic treatment of passion by such writers as Descartes its conversion to clearly distinct psychological categories and to rational hierarchies of categories, worthiness and faculties must of necessity have brought about the dissolution of the myth and the arrest of its original impetus. For the sway of the myth is not asserted, but there where precisely all moral categories vanish. Beyond good and evil, in transports, and in the transgression of the sphere within which morality is valid. The case of Spinoza would deserve a chapter to itself, but his influence on manners only made itself felt 2 centuries after him. When the Sturm and Drang philosophers had translated him into German for the benefit of poets, and these had translated him into metaphors for the benefit of an emotional middle class. The case of Spinoza would deserve a chapter to itself, but his influence on manners only made itself felt 2 centuries after him, when the Sturm und Drang philosophers had translated him into German for the benefit of poets, and these had translated him into metaphors for the benefit of an emotional middle class. The ultimate result was to produce chatter about the divinity of countryside impressions on a Sunday. Spinoza defines love as, quote, joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause, end of quote. That's from Ethics, Book 3, Definition 6. The definition is accurate in a single instance, the only instance this mystic considers, when the external cause is a God with whom our soul may identify itself. I'm going to reread that one more time. The case of Spinoza would deserve a chapter to itself, but his influence on manners only made itself felt 2 centuries. The case of Spinoza would deserve a chapter to itself, but his influence on manners only made itself felt 2 centuries after him, when the Sturm und Drang philosophers had translated him into German for the benefit of poets, and these had translated him into metaphors for the benefit of an emotional middle class. The ultimate result was to produce chatter about the divinity of the countryside impressions on a Sunday. Spinoza defines love as, quote, joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause, end of quote. The definition is accurate in a single instance, the only instance this mystic considers, when the external cause is a God with whom our soul may identify itself. But Spinoza disregards the existence of obstruction. Actually, our human passions are always connected with antagonistic passions. Our love with hate, and our pleasures with our pains. Between joy and its external cause, there is invariably some gap and some obstruction. Society, sin, virtue, the body, the separate self. Hence arises the ardor of passion. I would add to that, this is the person reading, I would add to that like hard work, like something between our joys that we work really hard to achieve it. Like if we haven't put in the work, we don't feel like we deserve it. And hence it is that the wish for complete union is indissolubly linked with a wish for the death that brings release. It is because passion cannot exist without pain that passion makes our ruin seem desirable to us. When the Portuguese nun Mariana Alcoforado wrote to the man who had seduced her, she said, quote, "I give thanks to you from my innermost heart for the despair into which you have cast me. I despise the peace. I despise the peace in which I lived before knowing you. Adieu. Love me, then, forever, and go on making me suffer the cruelest torments," end of quote. Towards the end of the 18th century, another woman, Julie de Lespinasse, wrote, quote, "I love you as one ought to love, with despair," end of quote. But till the advent of Rousseau, the 18th century in France was indeed a period of total eclipse for the dark sun of melancholy. The points and worthiness which the rakes of the Regency and of the reign of Louis XV considered civil were no longer in any sense moral, but intellectual and physical. When the distinction between mind and body took the place of the separation of mind from believing soul, the result was to divide a human being into intelligence and sex. Actually, with every obstruction removed, passion was without impetus, and it became the fashion to talk of passionettes or little passions. The god of love was no longer an adamant destiny, but a cheeky child. Hardly anything was forbidden. Of the natural obstruction of modesty, enough was retained for the needs of the rhetoric of desire, but no longer even enough for the needs of that of love. "A fine virtue," Madame d'Epinay said, "that has to be attached with pins." I fancy that those pins were not mentioned by chance. "Love points you," the rhetoric said. A little later, blood was going to flow under the terror. But we are for the moment only at, quote, "war and lace cuffs," end of quote. Yet this century of sensuality was not that of sensual health if it was thought to cure it of the myth. Quote, "The women of our time do not love with the heart, they love with the head," end of quote, said Abbe Galliani. Quote, "An old blind debauchee of wit," end of quote, wrote Horace Walpole in a letter, and thereby gave perhaps the best description of feminine Don Juanism. For it is woman who dreamed of Don Juan. And although there were Richelieus and Casanovas to incarnate the dream, I am less sure of their reality than of that of the desire which created them. That desire was well viewed by the Goncourt brothers in their classical book on woman in the 18th century. Quote, "Instead of giving her the satisfactions of sensual love and settling her down to voluptuousness, love fills her with anxieties. drives her from one trial to another, from one attempt to another, shaking in front of her as she goes step by step into shame, the temptation of spiritual corruptions, a falsehood about ideals. The elusive caprice of dreams of debauchery, end of quote. Quote, a falsehood about ideals, end of quote, sums up indeed whatever cynical reaction the myth may have given rise to. I have mentioned more than one example. The 18th century was too polished to allow gauloiserie. It replaced that by an affectation of voluptuous facility. In the sally that all love amounts to no more than the touching of two skins, I see less the affirmation of an inhuman materialism than a proof of the secret persistence of the myth in the hearts of the men of the 18th century. A modicum of amorous illusion and diffused idealism had to subsist for Chamfort to have considered it piquant to note down the maxim and to have published it. It could still astonish. It was no more, and was destined never to become more, than an inverted idealism. But till the advent of Rousseau, the 18th century in France was indeed a period of total eclipse for the dark sun of melancholy. I already read that, sorry. Don Juan and the Marquise de Sade. If we shut our eyes after gazing at a white statue, we shall have the image of a black. In the same way, the eclipse of the myth conjured up the exact opposite of Tristan. If Don Juan, historically speaking, is no invention of the 18th century, the period nevertheless played in relation to this character the very part assigned in Manichaean doctrine to Lucifer as regards creation. The period gave shape to Tirso de Molina's Don Juan Tenorio, and endowed the hero of that play with two thoroughly typical features, noirceur and rascality. Nothing could be more directly the reverse of the twin virtues of chivalrous love, candor and courtesy. The way in which the mythical character of Don Juan stirs the emotions of woman and fascinates the minds of some men is to be accounted for, I fancy, by his infinitely contradictory nature. Don Juan is at one and the same time sheer spontaneity. Don Juan is at one and the same time sheer spontaneity of instinct and sheer mind aflutter over the sea of possibility. He is constant in constancy and also the constant quest of the one woman whom desire in its untiring self-deception is never able to find. He is the insolent avidity of a youth renewed at every fresh encounter. And he is also the hidden weakness of an inability to possess, because devoid of enough being ever to have. Let me be content with taking the dramatic Don Juan as an inverted reflection of Tristan, and in Mozart's Don Giovanni rather than in Molière's Don Juan, for the latter, in my opinion, is by far the less significant. It may be mentioned incidentally that at its original production in the 17th century, Molière's play had no success. The contrast occurs first in the external demeanor and movement of the two characters. Don Giovanni seems always to be riding the high horse and always to be poised in readiness to leap forward again whenever he chances to have halted in his progress. But Tristan walks onto the stage with the somnambulistic deliberation of one hypnotized by some object of wonderful and inexhaustible value. The former possessed 1,003 women. in Spain alone, and plus 1,062 in other countries. The latter only one. But it is the man of many who is poor, whereas in a single being infinitely possessed there is concentrated the wide world. Tristan can forego the world because he loves. But Don Giovanni, although incessantly loved, is never able to love in return. Hence his anxiety and his agitated wanderings. Don Giovanni seeks in the act of love a voluptuous profanation. By remaining chaste, Tristan wishes to achieve a divinizing prowess. Don Giovanni's line is rape, and no sooner has he scored than he surrenders the field and flees. But the rule of courtly love made of rape the crime of crimes, a felony for which there is no remission, and of homage a pledge unto death. Don Giovanni, however, likes crime for its own sake. And in that way subjects himself to the morality which he transgresses. In order to enjoy abusing it, he has the greatest need of its existence. In order to enjoy abusing it, he has the greatest need of its existence. Tristan instead considers that he is freed from the play of rules, from sins and virtues, having been granted the grace of a virtue which transcends both the world and the law. In sum, the antithesis is as follows. Don Giovanni is the demon of unalloyed eminence, a prisoner of worldly appearances, and the martyr of a more and more deceptive and despicable sensation, whereas Tristan is the prisoner of a realm lying beyond night and day, and the martyr of a rapture which is transformed at death into unalloyed bliss. It may also be noted that if, when the commander holds out his hand in the last act, Don Giovanni jokes, laughs loudly, and provokes death, he thereby redeems in a supreme act of defiance the base deeds that would have dishonored a true knight. But Tristan, sad and brave, never surrenders his pride till luminous death is at hand. I see the two to have only one feature in common. Both appear sword in hand.